Yeah. Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW LP Brattleboro. I'm your host and producer of the show, Olga Peters, and this is where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. Hey, John Walters from the Vermont Political Observer. So glad you can join me today.
I'm the emergency guest when somebody has to cancel for whatever reason, and
Yes.
occasionally I'm first choice. But either way, I'm glad to be here.
You're always first choice, even when it's, scrambling and I'm freaking out. Well, we talking about scrambling, I think where we should start is the December 1st letter from the commissioner of the tax department about property taxes and education taxes.
Yep.
Um, Folks, if you haven't seen it, every year the commissioner from the Department of Taxes puts out what's called the December 1st letter. And it basically outlines what the tax department believes will be the property tax increase or decrease or whatever it's going to be for the education property taxes in the coming year. And last year, it was a very high increase. This year, they are predicting a 12% average increase, um, to which the tax commissioner said that would be 41% increase in education taxes over 5 years, if you look at the increases collectively. Um, we should know that depending on what school budgets do, what the legislature does, that tax increase may not come to pass, but it could. But
Almost,
that's just the
almost certainly,
starting point.
it will almost certainly be tremendously reduced, if not eliminated entirely.
Okay.
School districts will do their best to hold down costs, partly because they want to be responsible to everyone, and partly because they need to get their budgets passed by their taxpayers.
Yeah.
And Governor Scott and the legislature will probably do their best to buy down as much of the remaining increase as they can, just as they did this year, 2025.
Hmm.
They spent a lot of one-time money to buy down the projected increase in this year's taxes, and they will, I would guess, they would do the same for next year if they at all possibly can, which is going to be difficult, but they are powerfully motivated.
Yeah. Well, I think we should note one thing, and then I have a question for you, John, that, folks, when we see a high increase like this, we need to remember that it's artificial. It feels really high because last year they artificially kept it low by using one-time money, to reduce the increase, which I've seen a lot of municipalities try to do this too, and it brings sticker shock the next year because not only do you have the increase, but then you have the increase you didn't see,
Yep.
um, and it causes heart attacks.
Yep.
And so it's not actually the best practice in many ways. But John, my question for you is, there's been a lot of headlines around the December 1st letter. The commissioner was, very, this is unacceptable. Rah, rah, he got very angry. Scott Beck sent out a letter saying, Vermont doesn't have a revenue problem, it has a spending problem. We got to do something about this. It feels like, it kind of just feels like a lot of yelling without actually giving any solutions. Am I wrong with that?
Well, I mean, the whole process uh, for over the last few years in trying to address the, the problem that Governor Scott identifies at every opportunity, which is our school population is falling, our population is getting older. We either need to dramatically boost our younger population of families with children, or we need a smaller school system. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
that problem is out there.
Mm-hmm.
There are also, and that problem is what the governor and lawmakers have been trying to address in
Yes.
the last couple of years. There are other problems that are being ignored. One is that the property tax system is not the most just or equitable or thorough way to fund schools, and there has been no action on reforming the taxation system for education. The other is that there are some significant cost drivers in the public education system that are not at all being addressed by the governor or lawmakers, one of which is the staggering annual rise in healthcare costs. Another is the fact that school districts in recent years have had more and more sort of social service burdens laid on them. They're
Mm-hmm.
doing a lot of stuff that a good argument can be made, should be done by the Agency of Human Services and shouldn't be put on school budgets. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and,
Or if the services happen at the school, the money should come from the
yeah,
Agency of Human Services.
or the staff should come from human services
Mm-hmm.
or whatever. I don't know. But that is a big driver because there are more students with needs of various kinds uh,
Yeah.
than ever before. Um, so there are things in this, and the big thing, the universal, almost universal response to the December 1st letter was, we've got to push ahead with school reform as enacted in Act 73.
Right.
Act 73 will do nothing about this year's taxes because it won't
Mm-hmm.
even start taking effect until later. And its efficacy in bringing down costs is entirely theoretical. There's no proof that this will lower costs.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in some ways, it may increase costs. If you have administrators shepherding larger school districts, then you might have to pay them more. You might need more administrators, not less. And the big thing is that if you have larger school districts and you're trying to consolidate school populations, you might have to build a bunch of new schools, in the right location or with the right facilities. The governor talks a lot about improving educational opportunity. That might mean a lot of new facilities
Right.
at these centralized schools. So, there's no proof that that fewer school districts will mean less money spent. And there are good reasons to think that it might actually increase costs. And we are ignoring most of the big cost drivers in the system. So aside from that, it's great. Me as a political observer, I look on this with something akin to horror, just in terms of what this means for the 2026 election season.
Oh,
Because
interesting.
if if the Democrats were serious about uh, you know mounting an effective, winnable campaign against Phil Scott, assuming he runs again, and I see no reason to think he wouldn't, um, then the school reform issue is an obvious number one thing to, hit him with, because,
Mm-hmm.
his agenda is unproven. It's not really an education reform plan. It's just an attempt at reining in cost. Uh, and it's going to hit, his parts of the state the hardest, the rural areas. So
Yeah.
this would seem to be a great opportunity for a Democratic gubernatorial candidate to develop an alternative policy. But when you have Democratic legislative leadership running just as fast as Phil Scott to get behind Act 73 and promise to push ahead with it, then they've kind of cut the legs out from under any potential Democratic gubernatorial candidate. So
Mm-hmm.
I see this whole thing as making it even less likely that a credible, well-known candidate will actually run for governor on the Democratic ticket next year. And we're going to wind up with probably another little known, underfunded candidate going against an incumbent governor who gets the highest population ratings of any governor in the nation.
Hmm.
Um, and, I don't see much hope of that happening. And I am, dispirited that Democratic leadership did not take a look at what the task force actually wrote about Act 73 and what they suggested about Act 73, not to mention the universal anger and consternation that the task force encountered in its season of public hearings and public meetings, and say, maybe Act 73 was a mistake and maybe we need to try this again. Instead, they seem to have, leadership seems to have, like, this is now, they are committed to it and they're going to see it through, whether it's a good idea or not, and whether it's popular or not.
Hmm.
And I, that puts them in a much weaker position for challenging Phil Scott, and it puts them in a weaker position for, you know, trying to win back some of the Republican gains from last year.
Mm.
The Democrats are going to try to win back seats, some of the seats they lost last year, try to win back supermajorities if they can. Um, they're going to get a big boost probably from Donald Trump's unpopularity, but they're going to be, um, swimming against the current when it comes to Phil Scott. And I'm not sure how they develop a coherent alternative agenda to what Phil Scott is putting out there. Um, so, I'm feeling kind of gloomy, but it's the darkest time of the year. So.
As we both look out our respective windows and see that the sun has already gone down behind the horizon.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I think one thing that has boggled me about Act 73, and I always put the disclaimer out there that I may just be missing something. Um, but it feels like in so many ways we tried this with Act 46. And at least I can't speak for the rest of the state, but in parts of Windham County, it was not a pretty sight at all. And some of that was just people's emotions about their school district, but some of that was just straight up logistics. What do you do with school choice if you're solidifying a district? Um, and I guess with Act 73, I never fully understood what it was doing different than what Act 46 tried to do. And maybe it is, and it was just never clearly communicated by the administration. But that's a question mark that's, I think, held over 73 the whole time. And I think it contributed to some of the feedback that the task force received from the public.
Well, I mean, the other thing that happened that I read in reports in local newspapers about these various meetings held around the state was a level of surprise that you don't usually see in the public, uh, in the case of a very high profile issue that was like the number one issue for the legislature for an entire
Mhm.
session. And I think that's because Act 73 was put together very late in the session and was dramatically recast by the conference committee, the House Senate Conference Committee,
Good point.
in a session that went at least a month late just because of this issue.
Hmm.
So it's not like Act 73 really got a thorough public vetting, even the kind that you would get if it had, emerged through the normal legislative process rather than like being completely rewritten and recast at the very last minute.
Hmm.
So, a lot of people were kind of stunned and shocked that this might mean that like their local school could close, or that they might, instead of being able to elect a local school board, they might be electing like one representative to a regional school board, and really having little to no input into what happens with their local schools anymore. Um, and so, for the legislature, I mean, I can understand why they wouldn't want to go back to the drawing board and try again, especially with Phil Scott out there yammering about Act 73. Um, uh, I don't know. I think they have willingly put themselves into a box and somehow managed to close the lid and tape it shut.
Hmm. Yeah, I think the other disconnect with Act 73 is for a lot of people, their concern was property taxes, and they couldn't directly see how this restructuring would change taxes. And in its executive summary of its, at least the draft report that I've seen, the good grief, redistricting task force.
The
Um,
school redistricting task force.
Say that again, please.
School district redistricting task force. It,
Okay, that is your job, and the rest of this podcast is to say that for me because yeah, I cannot get it right. But one thing they said is
it's a ridiculous name.
it really is. Should we
Stupid.
just rename it? I don't know. What should we call it? Listeners, email me. Let me know what this should be called instead. Um,
The
but
Doom Patrol.
the what?
The Doom Patrol.
Oh yes. Dun 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 dun. Um, so in the report of the task force that I'm not going to say the name of, they said that they couldn't find the data that they saw did not show how any of this redistricting and many of the things laid out in 73 Act 73 would bring down costs.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and instead of the big redistricting, they recommended creating what are called cooperative education service areas, which are a voluntary collaboration between different school districts and schools, strategic voluntary mergers, and comprehensive regional high schools. Um, which I think was clever because for a lot of people, they're like, we can see how a high schooler maybe could sit on a bus for 30 to 40 minutes, but an elementary school student, like, are you crazy? Um, so I just wanted to point out their recommendations because I actually appreciated them, whether or not they sugar off. I was like, okay, I can kind of see how these might work.
Mm-hmm.
Where the big the redistricting and government shuffling, I didn't see it.
Yeah. It might be cheaper in a few years' time.
Mm-hmm.
It might be more expensive, or it might be about the same. And as I said earlier, the big cost drivers are still there unchanged, even if Act 73 does go into effect, full effect.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I think people are right to be skeptical of this. I see very little chance that it will actually do what the governor says it will do, and you know, given the track record of governors and legislators in since the Brigham decision, which was more than a quarter century ago now, to effectively deal with this problem
Mm-hmm.
of locally governed but statewide funded school districts and lower population student populations. Um, their past track record does not inspire any confidence that they'll get it right this time.
No, no, and it's
Fortunately, our school systems are full of people who are hardworking, smart, and dedicated to their jobs, and they will soldier on and do the best they can with whatever the legislature dumps in their laps.
yes, yes, they have, and they will, and it will continue. Hopefully, I think next week, we're still confirming our schedules, but I do believe Senator Wendy Harrison is going to try to come on the show and talk, since she was on the task force, to actually talk about the work and talk about some of the data. So I'm looking forward to that. Hey, listeners, in the meantime, if you have specific questions for the task force or something like that, drop me an email at the montpelierhappyhour@gmail.com. Um, and I'll see if there's time. I'll see if Wendy can answer any of those.
Yeah.
One thing Act 73 has triggered for me is just a bigger issue in Vermont that I'm kind of keeping an eye on, and that's regionalization.
Ah,
because given a lot of our small communities and a lot of our small resources, regionalization makes a lot of sense.
mhm.
And yet, in practice, it can be really hard. For example, I was speaking with Sean Tester, who is the CEO of Northern Vermont Regional Hospital. And he and a neighboring hospital have tried to do a lot of like um, sharing of staff and sharing of programs. And some of them have been quite successful. But like in one case, they hired a staff member who would work between the two hospitals. They're about 45 minutes apart. And this is up in the Northeast Kingdom. And she finally quit because she says, you know what, I love my job, but 45 minutes in the Northeast Kingdom in winter in a snowstorm, like, eh. There's big hills in between. And so he was just talking through some of the realities of what it means to try to regionalize and cooperate between institutions. And, weather and driving distance is right at the top of the list of how do we make that work.
Yep. Yep. Which is something to think about when you are talking about busing large numbers of students 30, 40, 50, 60 minutes one way year
Mm-hmm.
round, especially from like mid-November to mid-April.
Which is like the most of the school year.
Most school year. Yeah. Uh, I don't know. I mean, we will carry on whatsoever, and anything that's weird or dysfunctional about our politics pales in comparison to what's going on nationally right now. So, we should be, grateful for the problems we have, I guess, instead of the problems we could have. So,
We have just about 5 minutes before we need to hear from some underwriters, John. And um, this next question I wanted to ask you for a few reasons, but just for the sake of listeners, when Emily and I first launched the happy hour, one of the things we wanted to explore is, what stories are we telling ourselves as Vermonters and how are they shaping our policy? And I realized in recent years I haven't been as explicit about that. So I want to be explicit when I ask you, you know, how much this are concerns around the education property tax. Yes, there are problems. Yes, there are things we need to fix. But, we often tell the story about Vermont being a high tax state. And we tell the story about education being too expensive. And so I'm curious for you, do you think there are any stories we're holding on to around ed financing that maybe are getting in our own way?
well, I mean, there seems to be a near universal acceptance that our current tax system is working fine,
Mm-hmm.
when in many ways it is not.
Okay.
And I think that's especially true, particularly true of, you know, paying for public education by property tax.
Mm-hmm.
Made more sense when property was a substantially larger portion of communal wealth than it is now. Why we don't come up with some sort of like hybrid system that includes, income and capital gains and takes the pressure off property taxes so that we don't have, seniors who are land rich and cash poor making tough choices about whether they stay or go.
Mm-hmm.
And, whether we spread the burden of an education system that we want to be really good and really strong more equitably over more of the economic activity that is generated in Vermont. That's something that used to get a little bit of chatter in Montpelier several years ago. The only person I have seen who has even broached that subject recently is former Lieutenant Governor Dave Zuckerman, who put out his own press release after the December 1st letter came out, in which he said, I've been talking about this for years. I see a way to, make some real savings in how we administer the public schools without centralizing control. And we have needed for years to take a serious look at reforming the funding mechanism for public schools. And, I think he's a voice in the wilderness at this point.
Mm.
And he doesn't have he doesn't hold a public office, and I don't see any real prospect he's going to get back into public office. Um, so, he's kind of out there in the wilderness and nobody else is talking about that anymore. And that seems to be of a piece with our whole approach toward our entire regime of taxation, whether you're talking state income tax, sales tax, property tax, um, the whole revenue mix. We have had commissions. The Blue Ribbon Commission on Taxation issued its report more than a decade ago, and they had some really good ideas, and it got routinely ignored. Um, there are ways we could reform our taxation system that would ease some of the pressure on hard hit groups and distribute the burden of running. It's kind of an expensive job to run comprehensive services in a small population state
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
with a lot of rural areas. That's a lot of plowing and a lot of road improvement and a lot of, a lot of everything. So
Mm-hmm.
um, that is one thing that has not been seriously talked about in Montpelier for a very long time. If Emily Kornheiser, as the chief tax writer for the House, ever, reemerges as a guest or a co-host on this program, maybe she will talk about that.
Uh,
But
she
she
and
is,
I have been texting to try to set something up. Yes.
I mean, now that she's chair of Ways and Means, she is understandably way, way, way busier than she used to be. But that is a question that would be, pertinently directed toward her.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's so interesting talking about stories. I'll try to make this quick. Another thing that was proposed 2 years ago, 3 years ago, maybe it was before COVID, but the wealth tax
Yep.
that a coalition put together and uh, worked out, like if we charge folks over this amount of money, income or wealth, then it will generate like 90 something $1 million. I
It
was,
gained a
what's
little
that?
traction after Trump's big tax reform of 2017,
Thank
when
you.
the wealthiest taxpayers got a huge break on their federal taxes. And some progressive people, capital and small p people in Vermont, looked at that and said, couldn't we take advantage of some of that capacity and the fact that Vermont is an attractive place for people to live who are people of means? And couldn't we, draw a little more money from them? And Phil Scott said no, 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 and nobody talks about that anymore. So,
Well, talking about stories, what I found fascinating is the number of people I know who were nowhere near the income level that this would kick in on, and they were freaking out that their taxes are going to go up. And I'm like, are you a millionaire? And they're like, no. And I'm like, it doesn't impact you. But
yep,
yet, it's so interesting how even we tell our, any tax, we assume it's going to hit us all equally. Um, and that's just not the case.
yep. And it doesn't help when you have Phil Scott and the entire Republican Party basically demagoguing any kind of tax reform proposal
Yeah.
by, putting out those fears. Uh,
Yes.
when in fact, a well-designed taxation plan would include consideration for working people and poor people. The idea would not be to put more of a burden on them. It would be to shift the burden to those who can afford to pay a little more,
Hmm.
but not going to happen anytime soon.
No, not this week at least. So hang tight, folks. John and I will be right back. We're going to hear from some underwriters here on WVEW LP Brattleboro. Hello, beautiful people. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW, LP Brattleboro. If you're just joining us, I'm your host and producer, Olga Peters, and I'm speaking with John Walters from the Vermont Political Observer. And in the first part of the show, we were talking about school property taxes and Act 73 and all those fun things that go with school education funding. And we have more numbers to talk about, but before we do, of course, I have to thank BCTV for taking the video version of our show and sharing it with media centers around the state, as well as reminding folks that the views and opinions of everyone on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the hosts and the guests and nobody else, not the platforms, not the radio station, nobody. We're quite good at, as John and I were joking earlier, being journalists, that whole reputation, talk about stories, biting the hand that feeds you. We're quite good at that, whether we want to be or not. And I have to, at least for the YouTube watchers, John, I have to say, do you like my little neck scarf?
We both went with the same theme, a dark shirt with a bright neck accoutrement.
Well, I had to wear something today because, John, I have to say, you always show up and you always have these spiffy ties on. And quite often I'm in a sweatshirt. Um, so I thought today I'd gussy up a little bit. So thank you for elevating my Zoom game. Um, we're going to talk a little bit about some numbers that have come out recently from the state around the tariffs from the federal government. But before we do, I just want to quickly throw something out there for listeners that I found really fascinating this week. I wasn't able to watch the whole multi-hour presentation, but the Joint Fiscal Office made their all legislature presentation yesterday, and it was live streamed on their YouTube channel, basically saying, hey, legislatures, this is kind of the financial landscape as we go into the new year. These are some things you might want to think about: transportation fund, taxes, revenues, all those things. But one guest I was able to hear was someone from an organization named called FFIS, which stands for Federal Funds Information for States.
Hmm.
And it basically, they do what they say. They look at federal budgets and bills and all those things and then analyze what that means for the states. And of course, I nerded out all over the place. But one thing the presenter said that really stood out to me, and I think is a theme I see from this administration, federal administration, the Trump administration, that in some ways worries me more than some of the funding shifts they've done and the grants they've canceled and that type of thing, is she was saying that traditionally, the presenter, when the federal government puts out a budget or puts out an appropriation memo or whatever it is, it usually comes with some sort of explanation about how they got there, kind of the parameters of the funding, what's acceptable, what's not. And I was like, okay, that makes sense. Well, the Trump administration is doing that less and less. And so they're getting these numbers without any context. And I just find that fascinating, this withholding of information. I hear it from planning commissions all the time, like, oh, I have to do this map work for my town and I can't get the right information from the federal government. It's not on the website anymore. And I think that's something worth mentioning for people to kind of keep their ear to the ground, because without that information, like, how do you make decisions?
Yeah. Yeah.
How do you know where the guardrails are?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. The Trump administration is sort of like bashing away at the government's capacity to do its job properly,
Mm-hmm.
and that the immediate impacts of that, you don't necessarily see them on a day-to-day basis, but it takes a toll over time. And whoever succeeds Trump, if they are actually interested in seriously governing, and running a government that is expected to do a lot for its people, then there's going to have to be a huge amount of rebuilding done. And that does have an effect, at all levels. It's not just like they issue a report in Washington, Congress ignores it, and it just goes into a file somewhere.
Mhm.
We all depend on the government in ways that are not always tangible, or usually not tangible to those of us in our daily lives. But, just like the National Weather Service, which is the backbone of all weather forecasting in this country. Um, you know, AccuWeather and Weather.com and the Weather Channel could not do what they do if they weren't getting all this information from the National Weather Service. If the National Weather Service isn't running properly, then we have a big problem in
Mhm.
terms of forecasting accuracy. So that's just one little bit of what is a much bigger problem.
Yeah,
And and Vermont has a much, much, much bigger, more immediate, specific problem with what's been going on in Washington, which I think is what we're about to start discussing.
exactly. The tariffs. I don't know about you, John, but when I do my roundup articles for Vermont Business Magazine and I touch base with the different counties, the tariffs, oh my gosh, they have been top concern. Housing, workforce, tariffs. Um, and for a state like Vermont that borders Quebec, borders Canada, um, I am hearing more and more frustration with the Trump administration's stance towards Canada. I'm hearing words like they're a tax, they're disrespectful. It's becoming much more. A lot of language around frustration,
Yeah,
and we're seeing it in the number of folks from Canada who just are not coming south.
yeah, it's staggering, and it's something that had been talked about in like the winter and spring and summer of this year, but it's kind of fallen off the radar. But it has come to pass that the fears that we had about the effect on Canadian tourism of the tariffs and of Trump's general unfriendliness toward Canada. Vermont is heavily dependent on Canadian tourism. Um, I saw a figure of $150 million a year in the Vermont economy.
Mm-hmm.
The, the impact is even greater proportionately in the northern part of the state, obviously. And tourism from Canada is down dramatically by like 30%.
Mm-hmm.
And that's $50 million um, and a year. And again, the impact is even greater in the northern part of the state. Um, you know, I saw a figure. These are figures from the state of Vermont. This isn't stuff being made up by a political consultant or something. You know, Border crossings are down year to date 31% from Canada to the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the visitor centers closest to the Canadian border have seen a 36% reduction in visits this year compared to last year. The warnings that Canadians were going to boycott the US have largely come true. And, we're probably going to see the slow rolling impacts of that in terms of business activity and possibly people going out of business in the northern part of the state, especially, and or just struggling more and more to make ends meet. And probably we are going to be seeing it in state revenue collections as well, from things like rooms and meals tax, and gas tax, and sales tax and everything else. There used to be I once knew a guy who ran a small motel in Burlington. He has since retired, and his motel has been converted to housing. Um, but he said that he routinely got customers from Canada who came down, booked a room for one night, went out and bought a bunch of big ticket stuff,
Yes.
appliances and new tires and all kinds of stuff
Mm-hmm.
because they were trying to avoid higher taxes in Canada.
Yep.
And that was a tremendous part of the economic engine in the Burlington area because that's where the big box stores are.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, I don't know how their receipts are doing, but generally speaking, we can pretty confidently say that Canadian tourism has taken a one-third hit compared to previous years, and that's a huge deal.
Yeah.
That's not counting what you started with, which is the impacts of tariffs on Canadian goods on businesses in Vermont.
Mm-hmm.
And that also needs to be accounted for, and that's all damage being done for no good reason by Donald Trump
Yeah.
and his friends.
I was talking to some contractors, and we're talking big contractors like DEW, Dubois King. It wasn't either of them, but large scale, multi big projects. Um, and they were saying, yeah, workforce is still a problem for them, but the tariffs has just driven up the costs of everything they touch to put into a house. And what do we need in Vermont?
Awesome.
More housing. And I was talking to a housing developer, like a Wyndham Windsor Housing Trust type person. And they were saying that, yeah, the tariffs have driven up. Here they are trying to create affordable housing, and their costs are like crazy and very frustrating. I just want to add something to the data about Canadian tourism. Probably in the same page that you saw the border crossings, there was a look at credit card spending
Ah,
between January and September of this year. And spending just in September was down 55%. Year to date, January to September is down 49%. And if you look, there's a bar graph for the years 2023, 2024, 2025. And 2024, like there was a lot of credit card spending happening in Vermont. And in 20, it's like 2025, it's like these little boxes.
yep,
So, and yes, like you said, it feels very unnecessary.
yep. But we're living with it, and we're going to be living with it for at least another year, I guess, and probably for the most part, another 3 years, assuming Donald Trump lives that long, which seems less and less likely every day. But him or his successor will presumably pursue the same policies,
Mhm.
same detrimental impact, especially on northern border states.
Yeah. There was one little bit of good news. I was talking to the Regional Planning Dash Economic Development organization up in the Northeast Kingdom. I keep bringing them up because that's the most recent article I've done. And he was saying that Quebec had been absolutely silent for most of the year, but now he has heard from a few businesses in Quebec who are like, what kind of office space do you have? What kind of manufacturing space do you have? So he was feeling hopeful, both fingers crossed, um, that maybe some folks are coming back this way.
Yeah, maybe if we go to war with Venezuela, that'll take some of the pressure off our Canadian relations.
Oh, I shouldn't laugh. Yeah, hope springs eternal, right?
Yeah,
More chaos.
that's what passes for hope these days.
Yeah, more chaos.
The chaos happens somewhere else.
Ouch. Um, so anything else you want to talk about? Tariffs, federal money.
I think that kind of puts a bow on it. This is a whole part of, the impacts of Donald Trump that had nothing to do with federal spending or rescissions, which
Yeah.
is another whole area of uncertainty facing, Vermont's budget writers for next year.
Mhm.
Um, but, the effect on revenue has got to be substantial and painful.
Yeah.
uh, for business owners and for, you know, tax collectors and state budget writers and everybody.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah, I'm hearing from organizations who were supposed to hear in like July about some grants, and they're still in limbo and haven't been told no, but haven't been told they're going to get it. And just going back to that whole chaos factor, how do you make decisions when A, you don't have information, and B, you're still in limbo, not knowing a yes or no.
yep.
Um, so one thing we've seen recently is a few changes at the legislative level. The Sam Douglas resigning after his that text chain went public is probably the one to have gotten the most press. However, there's been a few other people step down, and Jim Harrison announced today, right, that he will be stepping down from his Rutland 11 district seat.
It came to my attention today. It happened certainly recently.
Okay.
Um, Jim, for those who do not know, because he is not the flashiest or highest profile of figures, has been a fixture in the State House for decades.
Mm-hmm.
He was a longtime lobbyist for, I think, the Chamber of Commerce,
Okay.
or some business organization. Uh, and then he transitioned from that into serving the legislature. He is a very conservative Republican, so his policies are not to everybody's taste, but he is an honorable man. And he is an old-fashioned kind of conservative Republican who believes in, has principles and lives by them. And, he has been a solid, productive member of the legislature for a long time, representing his viewpoints, to be sure. He's also one of the nicest people you'll run into in the building. And he and his wife are moving to Florida for personal and family reasons. And so he's going to leave the legislature in January. And it's not going to make the headlines that, Sam Douglas made. But it's going to be a loss, and I probably, given the makeup of the electorate there, they're going to elect someone who is equally conservative but a lot more Trumpy, and that'll be a loss for the legislature.
Hmm.
Um, I I would not be surprised if these aren't the first in a wave of resignations and retirements.
Interesting.
Um, this is a completely sort of off the cuff. I wouldn't even call it a prediction. It's just a possibility that I think is a very real one, for different reasons. A lot of Democrats in the legislature were deeply unhappy with the Act 73 process and more generally with how legislative leadership does its business, which is sort of in a very top-down fashion. So there's a lot of frustration in the ranks in the Democratic caucus. Uh, State Rep Heather Serpinant resigned earlier this year, I think in the fall, and has just been replaced. Um, so there are probably a lot of Democrats who are wondering if it's worth the trouble to
Mhm.
serve in the legislature. Um, there were a lot of Republicans elected last year, like a Sam Douglas or like another resigned Senator, Larry Hart, who really didn't understand what the legislative process was about and were not interested in learning about it. They came in with grand expectations that they were going to ride to the rescue and impose their agendas and get stuff passed by the legislature and, ride off into the sunset. And that's not how legislative bodies work. They're complicated, they take time, they reward seniority because people who've been around for a few years know how things work and know how to, pull the levers better. And especially if you're in a minority, uh, you kind of take what you can get. Uh, and I have heard grumbling from people like Sam Douglas and Larry Hart and others about committee assignments and the fact that the bills they proposed didn't go anywhere. Bills proposed by the minority almost never go anywhere. And that has always been true, no matter who the minority is. So I would not be at all surprised if a bunch of those Republicans who won in 2024 are already sick and tired of the whole thing and decide to get out.
Hmm.
So, I think we could look for that to happen, which again would make it harder for the Republicans to hold on to the gains they made last year. But at the same time, if the Democrats have a bunch of retirements, they'll be defending ground that they didn't think they were going to have to defend. So we shall see. But I would not be surprised if we have, uh, 2 or 3 dozen, just picking a figure out of a hat,
Okay.
uh, you know, retirements or resignations. That would not be a terribly unusual number. It could be higher than that,
Hmm.
out of a total of 150, 180 representatives and senators. So it could be, getting close to the 1/3 or something like that at the extreme. That's a lot of turnover and a lot of, scrambling for new candidates for legislative seats that are always hard to fill. So um, it could be a year of resignations and retirements. That's
Hmm.
all I'm saying.
Which would be interesting because if people resign or retire now, it's the middle of the biennium. And
Hmm.
so they will be their replacements will be appointed by the governor. And we'll just remind folks that what happens in that case is the county chair, county party, caucus, whatever, what do
In
you
the
want to call
case,
them?
in the case of a legislative district, the town or city party
Thank you.
committee in the district.
Will put forward a few names, and then the governor will appoint from that batch of names, and usually will appoint someone of the same party of the person who had resigned. But I don't, that's not set in stone. Um,
Tradition is the governor replaces a like with a like and chooses from the names presented to him by the local party. None of that is in the law. The law simply states the governor will choose somebody
yeah.
to fill a legislative vacancy. We do not have special elections in Vermont. So yeah, he and his team may be very busy vetting candidates to fill vacancies in
Hmm.
the coming year. So
And it means that at least for the rest of the term, those are people that hadn't been elected by their own district. It's just interesting.
yeah,
Not good, not bad, just interesting. Um, ugh, there's something else I wanted to add. Um, I guess it wasn't that important. It went shoop.
I will also say that the governor tends to appoint people who are kind of a little bit caretakery
Ah, okay.
rather
Good
than
point.
like people who have actual ambition to serve for multiple terms, and they will often serve for the rest of the term and maybe leave after that, or serve maybe another term or something like that. But they don't tend to become fixtures in the legislature. So it's a little more spackle
Mm,
in the wall, and a little less structure.
interesting. Good point. Oh, I remember what I was going to say. So this is just putting this out there for anyone who's thinking, maybe I want to serve in the legislature. You know, the way our system is set up, you don't have to have any specific experience um, to run and serve, and that's actually quite beautiful in many ways. But I would encourage anyone if you're considering becoming a lawmaker, running for office, I would encourage you to run for school board or select board or something like that because it's a really great training ground to really test yourself and see do I like sitting in these long meetings? Do
Yeah,
I like talking about policy? Um, do I like working in collaboration with people? And it's good training. So
yeah,
consider it.
yeah, yeah. It's a great way to, and you're doing a service to your community. These seats are generally a little hard to fill,
Hmm.
and there's always a need for good people. And especially in a state like Vermont, you don't need to be a lawyer or a political scientist or anything like that. Um, the citizen legislature is founded on the idea that we want a variety of backgrounds and skill sets in our legislative body to more fully represent the diversity of the state.
Hmm.
We want farmers, and we want seniors, and we want parents with kids, and we want the odd person of color here and there, and it would be I would love to see a political system where poor people could run her office, because I think the views of people who are like dependent on social service programs, uh, always or part of the time, uh, are valuable. They often have real insight into what's going on and what could be done better. So, it would be really great if more working people and even poor people could get in the door, because right now the door is pretty much closed to them. It would be really difficult logistically for somebody who has to struggle to make ends meet to take, 4 or 5 months away from the job and go to Montpelier 4 days a week. But
For a
whatever
stipend.
we could do to foster that would be great. And it's much better that we have a variety of people in the legislature than what they got in Vermont, which is a bunch of politicians and lawyers and careerists.
In the
So
federal government, you mean?
yeah,
Yeah.
in DC.
Yeah, and I like what you said about folks who, you know, are poor folks, because many of them interact with government quite often more than folks with more resources. And so they know where government isn't working well.
I have heard some really remarkable and insightful testimony from people, for example, who have experienced homelessness,
Hmm.
talking about what it is like to try to get housing from the state and what it's like to try to get shelter from the state, and how there are unnecessary burdens and ridiculous burdens, and how the state routinely screws things up and makes them start all over again from scratch. And it's a burden that shouldn't be put on people. And you only get that perspective from people who are on the receiving end of government services. So anyway, thus endeth my TED talk.
um, Before we switch topics to utilities, I just want to quickly add for listeners. I realized earlier when we were talking about tariffs and the cost of building housing, I said, "Oh, the amounts are just crazy," and I was like, that's a little dramatic. So, what makes me say that is, um, I was, talking to someone about a housing project in Windsor County in 2024 that had just opened, and each unit cost about $400,000 to build. And we're not talking like gold fixtures or anything. We're talking durable, affordable units. Talking to another person, Washington County, 2025, and their expenses are up to about $550 per $550,000 per unit. So that's, to me, that's a jump. Like,
That's a lot of money. I mean,
yeah,
that's kind of one third, more or less. And that's when a $400,000 unit is kind of outrageous enough if we're
yeah,
talking about building affordable housing.
yeah. Which
Yeah,
this person was saying it was when costs were already, inflation was starting to kick in and that type of thing. Yeah.
yeah, yep, yep.
But I'm
Um,
sorry, John, I cut you off.
oh, that's fine. That's what needed to be said there.
Thank you. So moving on, you came across an interesting article in the Hardwick Gazette, was it?
Yep.
And I'd love us to talk a little bit about it, because I am watching things in my neck of the woods around a small utility as well.
Yeah. Vermont has 14 municipal utilities, local power companies. Hardwick has the Hardwick Electric Department. And an interesting thing happened in Hardwick, and we'll start there, which is that the general manager of the Hardwick Electric Department was suddenly let go and replaced sometime in the last month, but there was no public notice, no public record, no public information about why she was replaced. with a guy who is now carrying the interim general manager tag.
Hmm.
The new guy, Scott Johnstone, uh, is has been for 3 years the head of Morrisville's municipal utility.
Okay.
And sometime in the fairly recent past, he became the interim head of Hyde Park's municipal utility. So he
Wait,
is
is he serving multiple places at the same time?
he's now wearing three hats. He is directing three of Vermont's 14 municipal utilities at the same time.
Huh.
And in Hardwick, this caused a lot of this big story in Hardwick because, doing this behind closed doors with no notice and nothing. It's like, the old general manager gave the general manager report at the October meeting. And at the November meeting, Scott Johnstone gave the report, and the former general manager was removed as a signatory on the electric department's accounts. Um, so, but there's and nobody's talking about it. Nobody would talk to the Gazette about it except, Scott Johnstone himself, who issued a brief gobbledygook statement saying that we would not comment on personnel matters and that we would issue whatever information we could at the appropriate time or something like that. It's like the appropriate time has already come and gone. I'm sorry. Replacing the head of a municipal utility is a matter of great public interest to the people who live there. And that's my concern locally in the Hardwick area.
Hmm.
My concern, my question more broadly, and I wrote a blog post about this, is this a move to consolidate utility services the same way that Governor Scott wants to consolidate public schools?
Which brings us back to that conversation about regionalization in general.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A couple of weeks ago, the administration's chief utility regulator put out a call to review. He is conducting comprehensive financial and management review of all 14 of Vermont's municipal utilities,
Hmm.
which you would think that that means that he either has concerns or he has an agenda. And, I am connecting dots here that may or may not warrant connecting, but I see, Scott Johnstone being installed at, heading up three of these small utilities. And at the same time, the administration is seeking all this financial information on all 14 municipal utilities. And it makes me wonder if, the ultimate goal isn't that we're all under the happy umbrella of Green Mountain Power or something. I don't know.
Hmm.
There are legitimate questions about small utilities' ability to meet the demands of current and future times, cyber attacks, the need to modernize our electric grid for the 21st century. Um, there are a lot of challenges facing our small utilities, and at least a couple of them seem to be having some financial issues. But is it a good idea? Is it something the administration is thinking about? I suspect that they are. I can't prove it. Is it a good idea? I have no idea. I don't know. I'm not smart enough to make those calls. But if it is something they are thinking about, I think that it should be, we should be aware of it,
Hmm.
and they should talk about it and, make their intentions clear.
Hmm.
So we shall see where this goes, but I flagged it for, future interest, and I'm kind of hoping that, more, bigger media outlets than little old me will be able to, pursue the story and see what's really going on with this call for financial information from municipal utilities and what's behind this sudden seeming consolidation of control in, these northern Vermont utilities. So
Hmm.
we shall see where that goes. And it all started with a story in the Hardwick Gazette. And I will, again, make my PSA for local journalism. Small newspapers around Vermont, we are blessed to have a lot of them. Some of them are for profit, some of them are nonprofit. They are all trying to do their best to provide public information. And, if it wasn't for the Gazette, this story would not be out there.
Yeah.
Uh, so people would not know, and they deserve to know. So support your local paper.
And thank you, John, for bringing that to our attention. And like you said, there's still a lot unknown, and
Mm,
so some of the dots may not actually connect.
yep.
But I think it's worth noting. And I think the small utility that I get my electricity from is seeking a rate increase.
Hmm.
And so if others are seeking rate increases right now, that might be one reason for asking for financial information, for example.
Hmm.
Um, but uh, I think what you're sharing also highlights the need for transparency.
Yep.
And even if something is a personnel issue, and yes, we companies should protect um, their employees' privacy. However, there are ways that you can still let people know what's going on.
Yeah.
Or if, say, we're going to protect their privacy, but we can tell you, no, we're not consolidating. This is the plan.
Yep.
Yeah.
A lot more information about the college hiring a new football coach than we get for the person who's running our local utility.
So true. Well, and also probably more people are watching the football coach than. What else does that say about us? Um, Thank you so much, John, for being here. Anything you want to leave listeners with before we move on?
Um, Now I'm going to say something. Rachel Maddow used to do a thing on her show called The Greatest New Thing in the World Today.
Mm-hmm.
And I will just say, completely off topic, that there's a lot of really amazing work being done in the sciences these days. A lot of science, there's some new information out there on dark matter if anybody's interested in that.
Oh, how
Just
cool.
heard an interview with somebody who wrote a really interesting book about how life originated on Earth. And the common idea is this little tidal pool, and suddenly there's a critter wiggling around in there, and it probably happened in the oceans
Oh.
around vents in the ocean floor that provided like minerals and other things that sort of jump started the process. The Vera Rubin telescope is doing a slow motion, groundbreaking information gathering on the skies.
Hmm.
Medical advances. We have problems with healthcare access and cost, but medical advances are remarkable. There's a lot of really neat stuff going on in the areas of human endeavor that we never talk about, and that rarely get talked about in the news anymore. But there's a lot of really neat stuff going on these days in the sciences and in other areas of human endeavor that have nothing to do with politics.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thank you. Thank you, John. John, if people want to read your work, where can they find it?
My blog is called the Vermont Political Observer, and it is just thevpo.org. And if Google my name and Vermont Political Observer, you'll find me. If you can't remember the VPO.org, I tried to make it as simple a hook as possible. So there you go.
Thank you so much. And as always, folks, the Vermont the Montpelier Happy Hour is on WVEW LP Brattleboro every Friday at 2 p.m. and rebroadcasted on Wednesday mornings, and of course, wherever you find your podcasts. Hey everyone, take care. Have a good weekend.